Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and also for this the summary of my talk. I think we can go right to questions now. Before I begin, I need to can you hear me? Before I begin, I need to explain to you that an attachment sent by email that was said to be required reading for this lecture is completely erroneous. It has nothing to do with my lecture, and no one knows how it came to you and why. So I'm standing, I'm not sitting, I'm standing here because the dignity of, I think, a Max Weber lecture would require it. When I was asked to deliver this lecture, my thoughts immediately focused on Weber as an exemplar of the historically informed social scientist. And myself, as an economic historian, I have spent several decades now pondering two very profoundly different disciplines and the challenges and rewards of attempting to combine and to integrate them. Moreover, I spent some time as an academic administrator at Berkeley, as dean and vice provost, and I was faced then with repeated calls for greater interdisciplinarity, break down these walls, dismantle the silos. But I also saw the living reality of disciplinary autonomy, which in fact seems to be a condition for the maintenance of a discipline. So I thought it might be appropriate then to use this lecture to address the relationship of history with the social sciences, economics in particular. I know this best, but I'll try to be more inclusive. This relationship, as it has evolved over the past generation, that is my experience with it as a historian, a student and a historian, and over the past generation, how it might develop in the near future. Now, it seemed appropriate, but on further reflection, it revealed itself as one of my less inspired ideas. I'm not really qualified to speak on my chosen topic this afternoon. I'm no philosopher of history or epistemology, not a specialist in historiography. I must speak primarily from experience and from untutored reflection, and that's limited by an academic career led primarily in the United States, where the relationships I'm describing may have played out a bit differently than on the European continent, and based on what I have learned in my brief time here, perhaps particularly at the EUI. So here I might be speaking to the choir, as it were, and not to my intended audience. But as these cautionary thoughts came to me, there was no turning back. So I will proceed with my paper, which is perhaps actually more of a sermon. And like all good Protestant sermons, it has three parts. And I take as my text the Book of Stone, 1979, pages 74 to 96. I think this explains what I really mean here. So the first part, the revival of narrative. In the mid-1970s, a broad range of scholars spanning the ideological spectrum were actively engaged in what has been called new historical research and debate. I'll speak about some of the participants in this broad movement in more detail later, but for now it's sufficient to simply mention the French Annales School, the American New Economic History, British Marxian social history, historical sociology in its several forms of kind of modernization theory, world systems theory, among them. Needless to say, they disagreed with each other on nearly everything. But if there was a single point of agreement, it was this: the rejection of narrative history. It led Peter Burke, a British, then social, now cultural historian, to introduce the final volume of the New Cambridge Modern History, which appeared in 1979, with the following claim that you can read on the text. In the 20th century, he says, we seem to break with traditional narrative history. And then he compares that to the break with the traditional novel, or with representational art, with classical music. In other words, he says this is one of the important cultural discontinuities of our time. The implication is there is no turning back. Now, obviously, no single influence can claim full credit for this historiographical discontinuity that he is announcing. But the most profound factor must be the spread of the uncomfortable feeling that the narrative form greatly restricts the types of possible historical questions that can be asked and feasible modes of explanation. Narrative history has attached to it like a ball and chain the discrete short-term historical event, l'histoire événementielle in the French tradition. And if by then 50 years of annal school preaching had done anything, it had undermined the notion that this should be the foundation stone of historical explanation. Now, in the opinion of Bob Dylan, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. But history in those days did have a weatherman. And in the very year that Peter Burke associated the new history with the future and with the avant-garde, the weatherman spoke. So Lawrence Stone, a British historian, then spent most of his life teaching at Princeton in the United States, sensed that the vast majority of historians, certainly in Britain and the United States, have no heart for the new scholarship. Or if they once paid allegiance to it, they were not withdrawing it. Why was that? Stone identified two broad reasons. First, the political sentiments that had led many to pay lip service to material and collective historical analysis were, he thought at that time, eroding. Stone pointed to disillusion with economic determinism and an associated decline in ideological commitments, especially to Marxism. Historians were searching for another basis on which to advance their political commitments. And secondly, Stone felt that social scientific historians, and quantitative historians in particular, had not fulfilled their claims. That is, they had failed to deliver the goods and alienated readers with often inaccessible techniques and methodologies. Thus, they were disillusioned, perhaps also fearful. In the revival of narrative, Reflections on a New Old History, the article that Stone wrote in '79, he foresaw historians refocusing their research increasingly on individual agency and eschewing analytical for descriptive modes of explanation. If I am right, he concluded, the movement to narrative marks the end of an era, the end of the attempt to produce a coherent and scientific explanation of change in the past. Now, this struck me, particularly this sentence, at the time, as a breathtaking statement and confession. Stone himself had been a leading practitioner of a kind of social scientific history. He had tried to produce coherent explanations of the English Civil War and the rise of modern family life that relied, both of them relying on social scientific analysis and no small amount of quantitative study. In this article, he was predicting where history as a discipline was headed. It was a direction that appeared to reject his own life's work. But he did not seem to regret it at all. He seemed to take some pleasure in tearing down the temple around his ears. And his prediction was accurate. Indeed, Stone's prescience was not limited to Anglo-Saxon scholarship, for the shift toward microhistory and a narrowing of the venerable Annalise concept of mentalité was underway in France at the same time. By the time of the linguistic cultural turn in the early 1980s, the project to more closely integrate history and the social sciences seemed bizarre to the great majority of historians, who could only utter the word science with an ironic tone of voice. And here I think this doesn't translate so well into other languages, because the term science is much more inclusive than, say, the term Wissenschaft and the other ways in which science-like language is used in most European countries. Well, we're talking about a return to narrative, and so what we need to say a little more about this narrative history. What are we talking about? Narrative refers to the organization of material in a chronological sequential order to form a single coherent story. Might have subplots, of course, but a single coherent story. One might express surprise that history could take any other form, since chronology is so closely associated with it, and since historians, of course, have always told stories. Indeed, the ancients regarded history as a branch of rhetoric rather than a philosophy. Moreover, it would be an exaggeration to claim that even social scientific historians ever completely abandoned narrative. I've been telling you one here. But they ceased to rely on it to give explanatory meaning to their work. They questioned the epistemological validity or its cognitive value, and they felt it even prevented asking the right historical questions. So narrative relies on description more than analysis, focuses on man, the individual actor, more than circumstances, and emphasizes the particular more than the collective experience. So to defenders of narrative, its virtues are usually seen to reside in its correspondence to the form in which people live and experience life. Thus, Paul Ricoeur claims that narrative is the literary genre that provides the best analogy for the actuality of life. Life and narrative both take place chronologically. Similarly, Hayden White, another pontificator on narrative, argued that the function of history is to produce stories that will disclose, that's the word he used, not explain or analyze, but disclose, as in reveal, the conditions of the present time. I think both of these theorists of narrative make claims that seem to associate the writing of history with the writing of fiction. Not that they are the same, but that they work in the same way. They emphasize thereby the subjective, creative activity of the historian, who must employ the imagination in order to construct a history via observation, empathy, and understanding. So imagination is essential to bridge the chasm of historical distance that separates historical distance that exists between now and then. The past is a foreign country, it became fashionable to say in those years, with the implication that one could never know it in anything like a scientific way. To think otherwise would be was naive. Now, the critics of narrative history directed their criticism precisely at its very naturalness. Narrative had a seductive power that carries the reader along. It offers an intellectually satisfaction when things seem to fall into place. We might concede all of these points, and yet still object that good stories may well be untrue. Chronology is not causation. Description is not explanation. Understood in the sense not simply of elucidation or making clear, but of determining the cause. Surely, one might counter, a carefully constructed narrative may be essential to explain events in that latter, deeper sense. Perhaps, but will it ever be sufficient? After all, how do we decide which narrative to use of the many that might plausibly be constructed? Now, the discipline in the traditional discipline of history is, I believe, the obligation to seek concurrence among all available evidence in the construction of a narrative. That is, we can't just be random in which evidence we incorporate into a narrative. Yet even here it appears that the criteria for concurrence must reside outside the framework of the narrative itself. It doesn't reveal itself in the course of constructing the narrative. Now, a characteristic of secular modernist academic culture is a commitment to what are sometimes called metaphors of verticality, that is, surface reality versus the deeper hidden reality. Indeed, things directly observable are not really real, are not the real reality at all. The task of inquiry, of scientific inquiry, is to get down to what's fundamental and usually hidden from direct view. Thus, explanation is deeper than description, and the normal practices of narrative historians are easily dismissed then as epistemologically naive, remaining at the surface of things. Now, this has been the criticism of traditional history made in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and it bit hard. On many fronts, and not only in economic history, it supported the development of a new history that would gain explanatory power via alliance with the social sciences, and would cease to rely on the narrative structure itself in order to impart meaning. When, in 1972, the Social Science History Association was founded in the United States, and there would later be a European Social Science History Association too. It organized itself into at least a dozen distinct disciplinary networks. Historians over a broad range, and not only in economics or sociology, were eager to embrace the social sciences. Now, social science history did not succeed in achieving all of its aspirations. Stone refers to disappointment in its achievements as one of the causes for the revival of narrative. But here I suspect he was being just a little bit disingenuous. What he, along with many historians, most disliked about the new history, why his prediction was so laced with a kind of schadenfreude, was its technical inaccessibility and the scale of its ambition. Historical research in the New Mode required often team efforts, large databases, computers, which in those days meant punch cards, mainframe computers, codes, and of course, recourse to methods and theories that were not intuitively available to the uninitiated. In short, it had to assume the organizational forms of a science. For him, this was a big step too far. Even the most ambitious historians were expected to communicate their findings to an educated lay reader without mediation. This was deeply ingrained of the historians. I have a bunch of examples here, but I'll skip over them. So we have hundreds of histories, but we don't have history. Well, so this brings me to part 2 of the sermon. Social science history, or historical social science. I introduced myself earlier and I was introduced as an economic historian. Economic history strives to be an interdisciplinary field of study, and while some such fields seek the interstices of established disciplines in order to escape from all discipline, mine expressly subjects itself to both history and economics, with the aspiration of contributing not to one, but to 2 disciplines. This, at any rate, is how I see it as an ideal type, perhaps. Now, this makes us highly sensitive, perhaps like canaries in the cage taken down into the mines, to any developments in either of these disciplines that aid or hinder collaboration between these very different fields. Well, how different are they? Karl Popper, 50 years ago, pronounced economics the first of the social sciences to go through, and I quote him, to have gone through its Newtonian revolution. Well, we might now imagine these evolved economists as the first amphibians among social scientist fish, laboriously learning to use their stubby little fins to scramble on the shore. And by now, it's 50 years later, they have moved well inland into the Newtonian forest, and as if in acknowledgement of this, a kind of Nobel Prize is awarded to economists, but not to any other social scientists. Well, meanwhile, as I've just recounted, history as a discipline was kind of, you might say, moving further out to sea. The prospect of evolving as scientists lost its appeal to these historian fish, and instead historians of the past 3 decades have shed perhaps several of their functional limbs to become rather simpler organisms, organisms that attract attention increasingly by their bright color, and exotic and diverse forms. Now, some see this as inevitable, and all things considered, even desirable. It represents the working out of a natural division of labor between the deductive and the inductive, and an inductive discipline, between a nomothetic economics and an idiographic history. But I've just tried to show that this gap is not a constant, but rather it is now larger than it was before, that it has sort of like an accordion gone back and forth over time. And it's not simply a reflection of some kind of eternal academic structures. And so I want to turn now to discuss ways in which a closing or a reduction of the size of that gap has been explored since history's return to narrative in the 1980s. So I'll begin with what I know best, what was called the new economic history. The first approach in the United States was to make history more social scientific, was to appropriate both the methods and theories, especially from economics, but also from sociology and political science. This reflected to some degree a kind of Cold War-inspired desire for a more objective historical scholarship, one with standards sufficiently rigorous to withstand ideological manipulation. And as I said earlier, this interest was widely shared among historians in the United States. But the search for rigor was certainly pushed furthest in economic history. There, as the economic historian Naomi Lamoureux observed, and I quote her here, a small group of economists launched a veritable revolution, seizing control of the discipline's organizations and using them to build a coherent body of scholarship based on the application of economic theory and econometric techniques to the study of the past. So this new economic history, and as it became older, it took to calling itself theometrics, confronted traditional history with a direct challenge to its practices and norms. The articulation of clear, testable hypotheses needed to be made central to scholarly inquiry in history, as it already was in economics. Testable historical hypotheses require the articulation of counterfactuals, might say alternative histories, against which to test the hypothesis. Now, all of this certainly challenged the discipline of history. but it uncritically embraced economics. Indeed, economic historians ran the danger of becoming a type of applied economist, deploying neoclassical theory to study the same market phenomena and the same necessarily short-term processes that preoccupied most of their mainstream economist colleagues. So this academic adventure was dramatic. Journals were transformed, reputations turned upside down, audacious claims made about what really happened in history, including what caused the Great Depression of the 1930s. The current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board and Obama's first chair of his Council of Economic Advisors both made important contributions to historical monetary policy. Yet, however dramatic, the new economic history did not have much influence on either discipline. History turned away, and as noted, economics was not directly challenged. They hardly noticed any difference. In the same period, but on another continent, others responded differently to the challenge of interdisciplinarity by advancing the audacious claim that rather than making history social scientific, social science should be made historical. To those seized with this vision, the first step was to renovate history as a discipline, to, as it were, prepare it for its role, to allow it to take its place as the queen of the social sciences. This was the stated objective of the French analysts, particularly the most influential of them in the post-war era, Fernand Braudel. So I'm not only giving the Max Weber lecture, but as a Fernand Braudel fellow, I feel some obligation to say a word about his role in our topic. He argued that to become the unifying center of all the social sciences, the historical profession had to overcome its continued allegiance to pernicious humanism, what he later described as a militant anthropocentrism, furnished with a, to quote again, a clear awareness of the plurality of social time and capable of incorporating the dialectics of both time and space. History and history alone could reconstitute the global nature of human phenomena. That this would be the integrator of social sciences, a kind of a framework in which social science theories could be developed in their fullest capacity. But Braudel's was a double critique of a history too fond of the mere event. And I'd love to quote from him in the English, those crests of foam that the tides of history carry on their strong backs. But also he was critical of imperialistic social sciences, fragmented and lacking in depth. So his vision was of a reformed history that could open a dialogue with the social sciences. The intention was not so much to refashion history after the social sciences as to make social science historical. History was to become a modern discipline, not simply by incorporating existing ahistorical social theory, although Braudel was certainly under the influence of French structuralism, but by deploying a new concept of duration and periodization, and a radically broadened, less anthropocentric field of vision with respect to context and agency. Now, this vision was much discussed by historians, but there's little evidence that it attracted the attention of most social sciences. I think one could accept anthropology here, which was in a crisis of its own in this time, and where it was attracted to many of these notions. It was a strong vision, but I think it's visible now only to those old enough to know where to look for it. This brings us to the second round of efforts to, as it were, reform, to create a social scientific, historical social science. Time passes. Historians and social scientists go their separate ways. The influence of the new economic history of the Annales school waned. Dialogue between historians and economists become less frequent and less amicable. But the basic problem remains, and there are important new efforts to address them that I want to just identify briefly. But unlike in the post-war decades, the attempts of the past 2 decades, say the 90s and the decade just ended, The attempts of the past 2 decades to restore history to social science and social theory to history have come overwhelmingly from social scientists. They feel more acutely, I think, the weakness of ahistorical theory. Perhaps they see opportunities left on the table by historians, data and case studies supplied by these useful drones, which historians themselves will not or cannot pursue in a theoretical and consistently theoretical way. Now, there are more strands to this story than I can recount, so I'm just going to mention a few that I think I know best. The new economic historians, as they deployed the power of neoclassical theory on historical data, soon became rather full of themselves. Stone was, I think, hypersensitive to this. But they included in their number some scholars who recognized the, well, you might say, the Faustian nature of the bargain that they had made. They had powerful tools to discern the workings of market forces in history. But the tools depended for that power on a mechanistic worldview that allowed to the past, at most, a transient role in shaping events. In short, they could give precise answer to rather narrow questions, to what was the rate of return on capital invested in slaves in South Carolina in 1860. They tended to find, over and again, that markets worked. They had, say, the same answer for every question. And the problem that they faced was, in a word, structure. So economic theory relies heavily on the concept of equilibrium, which is the imagined state which would be attained when all economic agents have accomplished all desired adjustments in endogenous variables to achieve their aim, which is to say, when all initial conditions and intervening events, exogenous shocks, in the past have been rendered irrelevant, when their effects have been so eroded as to become inconsequential. Which is to say, the long run in economics is not historical, nor does it lead us to historical insights. In a way, it's just the opposite. It refers to the state in which history has been erased, revealing pure, stable, unchanged structure. When Alfred Marshall, in his Principle of Economics in 1890, adopted the epigraph, is it there? No, I need to go further. Here we go. Natura non facet saltum, nature makes no leaps. He appropriated from evolutionary theory, as recently developed at that time by Darwin and Lamarck and Buffon, the doctrine of continuity. Nature always has the time at its disposal to achieve its aims. Neoclassical theory also embraced the probability theory that proved its great operational strength. Economic actions displayed ergodic processes possessing a limiting invariant probability distribution, which forms the basis of the unique stable equilibrium condition in which markets clear and systems can, and will, and must reproduce themselves. And this is a powerful concept, but it tells us that all events in the long run are transient in their effect. Now, Brodel had scolded historians for a too strong fascination with mere events, and neoclassical economics taught that events, shocks to equilibrium, were of no real account in the long run. But so the question, the historical question, but I think a social scientific question is this so? Does history really not matter in this way? Now, there have been two influential responses to the ahistorical character of neoclassical economics. The first was to bring back institutions. I say back because the chief rival to classical and neoclassical economics in the 19th century, before the triumph of the neoclassical synthesis, had been what has come to be called the German historical school. A better name is, I think, historical institutionalism. It held that economic behavior was not embedded in timeless structures, but was contingent on institutions. Institutions forming complexes that exhibited an organic unity, they thought, or a spirit. Weber engaged with these ideas, obviously. And each of these organic unities possessed its own possibilities, and indeed its own economics. But as I say, back also because the task now is not to acknowledge that history mattered because of institutions, exogenously determined institutions, but to bring historical institutions within the realm of economic explanation. That is, to endogenize institutional change. Now, this began with Douglas North's theory of institutions that I think is broadly familiar. He took a Cosian theory of the firm and the concept of transaction costs and applied it to the state, sought to identify a market for institutions, as it were, produced by the state, like a firm produces goods for sale on the market. It produced institutions in a historical context, and some of the outcomes encouraged efficient behavior, while others encouraged rent-seeking. And later, the new institutional economics developed further, exploring, under deVries in particular, exploring how institutions evolved historically from the bottom up, as it were, through private solutions to principal-agent problems, creating private order institutions that then interact with state power. In both approaches to institutional change, structure becomes something repeatedly reformulated through a kind of an internal dynamic. It's something akin to what historical sociologists and political scientists call systemic constructivism, where transactions among persons, groups, and other social sites lead to accumulations of systematic knowledge that can alter existing structures. The historical challenge in this work is to distinguish fateful events from mere events. And historical economics, or social science more generally, would identify sequences of events in the past that exert lasting effects upon current conditions, that, you might say, cast a long shadow forward in time. And this brings me to the second of these contributions, which is most strongly associated with Paul David and Brian Arthur. This is the second major response to the ahistoricism of economics. They invoked non-ergodic probability theory to challenge these, to characterize these, what I've been calling fateful events. This refers to probability outcomes that are highly sensitive to initial conditions or to initial moves. They do not gradually shake off early moves in a kind of evening out process, all leading in the same direction. But they take a particular direction and close the door to alternatives under the influence of these fateful moves. So the economy's later course, whether we're talking in the realm of institutions or of technologies or of spatial concentrations of production, that later course is dependent on the path laid out early on. That is, it's path dependent. It was Paul David's good fortune that he had a nice example to illustrate this. This is the QWERTY example. Everyone's familiar with why the computer and the typewriter keyboard the way it is. Well, it's not because it's the most optimal form. There was no grand convergence on the best possible outcome, but because of specific events in the early days of the technology of the typewriter, right, that made a particular technology, a particular layout functional. Later on, it was no longer necessary, and this takes a long time to explain, but there were now powerful forces keeping this suboptimal, suboptimal equilibrium point intact. He had the bad fortune that this, while easy to communicate, not easy for me, but an easy to communicate example, also seemed rather trivial. And one could say, well, is this all there is to it? I think there's much more to it. That's why I'm emphasizing it in this lecture. It has a great role not only on technology standardization, and this is a acute example of that, but on regional economic development and on the directionality and lock-in forces in economic life more generally. Where is path dependence likely to be important? This seems to be an empirical question. Not everywhere, but wherever the economy exhibits positive feedback effects and increasing returns to scale. It's in this environment where multiple equilibria hysteria and indeterminacy are found, and where fortuitous or passing events can play a large role in the direction the economy takes. Another, perhaps more important generator of path dependency is, however, more widespread. The irreversibility of investment. Some costs are sunk. They're not easy to walk away from. There's a big cost to doing so. Are such conditions rare, or are they pervasive? The current international crisis, I think, suggests that they are pervasive. But still, this is the question of how widespread these path-dependent phenomena are. This is a question that remains to be answered. The literature, however, is large and growing. One can see in both the institutional and the path-dependent theories efforts to loosen structural constraints without losing all coherence. That is, to recognize the power of human agency while preserving the ability to distinguish important fateful acts from mere events, and to capture the irreversibility of time's arrow, which creates long persisting suboptimalities. The spirit of this work, if I can borrow a word from the German historical school, shows affinities with other academic developments in complexity theory and evolutionary biology, and I'm told, but I don't understand it, in cosmology. Is it simply the flavor of the month, or of the decade, or is it a fateful break with an obsolete physical model in economics? In economics, Paul David, Abner Greif, Douglas North, people I've mentioned so far, urge the discipline to become more historical, to loosen the straitjacket of structures as embodied in neoclassical theory by incorporating the modifications of structure introduced by historical sequences, fateful events, irreversibilities, joint solutions that form new institutions, lock in new technologies, and interpersonal commitments. The point is not that structures do not matter, but that it needs to be endogenized. The other social sciences have also experienced I'll call it a historical turn in the last 20 years. This, so far as I can assess it, has emphasized the past more as context, as process, and of course as example, case study, and analogy. This has been done in sociology and political science, I believe, much more than it has involved the development of a kind of historicized theory. The structural sociology associated with modernization theory, but also Marxian-inspired materialism, inspired an historical sociology that's been called teleological temporality by William Sewell, a social historian and sociologist. In work of this sort, history revealed the working out through time of the inherent logic of social development as understood within a modern historic Marxist teleology. And such work can be very powerful. Think of Wallerstein's world systems or Chuck Tilley's accounts of state formation. These come to mind. But it was not so much based on historical data as it used historical data to illustrate and animate a theory. So history here is, you might say, doesn't play the role that a historian would recognize as a well, not a legitimate and interesting one. More common in both sociology and political science are comparative historical studies. These treat historical events and episodes, revolutions and other political turning points, usually, as far as I know, as so many separate trials of a kind of laboratory or a natural experiment. This has led to influential theoretical statements, works such as Scotchpole and Goldstone and Ertmann and Pearson. Also in economics, Acemoglu and his collaborators has made use of this kind of comparative historical work. But they do not really engage with the challenge of developing a historical social science. History is a kind of trove of information. The independence of the case studies is too readily assumed, and the comparative analysis suffers, to put it in social scientific terms, from too few ends and too many variables. One critic of sociology's engagement with history put it this way: sociology uses history as long as it does not allow itself to become the object of history, in the sense of recognizing the historical contingency of its own discourse. To be sure, criticism from within these disciplines of their legacy of structural theories has generated a new interest in the interaction of determinate relationships and contingent events, and to an easy deployment of metaphors of feedback processes, of configurations, crystallizations, layerings. These terms all seek to suggest some classificatory order of historical happenings. They are evocative, but they, I think, remain highly informal and at this point still more intuitive than one would like. But my mission here is not to criticize any specific work, but to note the absence in this historical term of an engagement with the discipline of history as such, that is, with must say, real live historians. The situation in the recent past seems to be the reverse of that post-war era that I discussed earlier. Since the 1980s, it has been historians who, as a body, are not prepared or inclined to engage with historical social scientists. And social scientists, some significant number, who have been groping toward historical alternatives to what might be called their legacy theories. So I come now to the third and final and the briefest part of the sermon, the present moment. I see some signs that history as a discipline in the United States, is emerging from the comfortable refuge it found and burrowed into some 30 years ago. The historicist and culturalist outlook adopted then united them with other humanists and defended the humanistic domain against hostile scientistic criticism. Historians could see themselves as fighting the good fight in defense of cultural understanding, of tolerance and empathy in a hostile world. But they paid a price for this, and the price is now being recognized more widely than before. The social historian William Sewell was an enthusiastic social scientific historian who made this cultural turn just as Lawrence Stone was announcing the revival of narrative history. And he recently wrote an essay reflecting on his discipline as it had changed over the course of his academic career. And you can read the penitent cultural historian's comments here. I worry that the triumph of cultural history was too easy. It meant the abandonment, and I emphasize without argument, though, without much discussion, without thinking of the pros and cons, the cost-benefit ratio, without argument of fundamental social historical notions of social science. And the result is a form of history that is disarmed, again, I emphasize that term, in the face of certain important questions posed to us by the history of our own era. What I think he mostly has on his mind here as one reads the rest of this essay is the capitalism he thought he knew in 1960 has changed. And the set of tools that he and his colleagues have to discuss it no longer seem particularly relevant, don't have much purchase on the actual realities of the present day. And without an engagement with the social sciences, it's impossible to, as it were, rearm. In other words, historians and other social scientists that rejected structure for postmodern epistemology, for social construction founded on semiotics, language, and signs, achieved only, in retrospect, an illusionary liberation from uncongenial facts on the ground. In this postmodern epistemology, the world is a highly malleable place, shaped and reshaped by semiotic practice. But the contrite Sewell now observes that it's not infinitely malleable. It does come back to bite you. And historians like himself, whose political engagement had initially led to abandon structuralism, now find themselves disarmed, unable to explain the changing material world. He expresses, in short, a partial disillusionment. I stress partial because it's not as though everything about the postmodern scholarship is useless and no longer relevant, but still a partial disillusionment with postmodern concepts. The insight that the social world is constituted by the interpretive practices of the actors who make it up once seemed liberating from the burden of history. But today it appears more like disarmament, a voluntary shedding of the tools needed to understand consequential historical change. But the issue isn't only one of disillusionment and, I might say, fear. It's also interest. New interest in large-scale historical questions for which the cultural turn, however valuable in other contexts, is not well suited or not sufficient. Now, this is not the place or the hour to delve into the new frontiers of historical research in any detail. So it will have to suffice simply for me to note that, and I've listed them here, that global history is today the unavoidable mantra of historical research. While economic historians have long studied globalization as manifested in long-distance trade or industrial competition or multinational firms, today the global, the transnational, is the preferred scope in which to study many political, social, and cultural questions. This type of history requires structure, some understood framework to distinguish the stable from the moving parts of the multiple contexts involved in global historical investigation. What I've done here is list these, let's say, new interests, but then I have placed in smaller type what I think they replace. Other forms of history that you might say they build on or that they reject, but nonetheless have to build from. These all seem to me to be either old-fashioned narrative history or the history of the cultural turn. And one sees then new questions or new frameworks in which the same domain of investigation has been reformulated in such a way that social scientific engagement seems to be recommendable or, if not necessary. So the other example is of the new interest is large-scale comparative history. The cultural turn succeeded in destabilizing the Eurocentric theories of, among others, Max Weber, which long had held both historians and social scientists on a sort of path-dependent course of research. Once it broke that mold and proclaimed a sort of multicultural victory, there emerged pressing new questions derived from current events, the rise of China and other non-Western economies, to put it in a nutshell, for which cultural studies had no real answer. What has come to be known as the Great Divergence literature, we associate, of course, with Kenneth Pomerantz, Arbin Wong, with Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, with Prasannan Parthasarathi. This has pressed the case for the value of theory-informed, systematic, comparative historical study. I can also point to the technological changes of the past 20 years that now simultaneously flatten the world, the journalist Thomas Friedman's New World Competitiveness notion, and greatly increased intra-country income inequality. In short, capitalism today is not the same beast that historians felt they knew and turned away from in 1979. It was Sewell's point that historians, after the cultural turn, were left without tools to study this. They only knew how to critique the high modernist, Fordist economic life that we can now only look back on with nostalgia. Well, there's more. There's environmental history. There's the fiscal and monetarist interpretations of the Great Depression now surely will be revisited. But let me conclude. Sewell's self-critical analysis of history's path over these past 30 years led him to call that coming from a very different direction for something akin to the path dependence and new institutionalism of the economists. Historical events, he argued, should be seen as happenings that transform structures. To quote him, to understand and explain an event is to specify what structural change it brings about and to determine how the structural change was effected. Sewell, too, distinguishes between mere events and fateful events. To do so, historians needed to break with narration, to suspend time, even if temporarily, in order to analyze and to explain. Thus, to quote him again, there can be no adequate diachronic narrative of an event without a synchronic understanding of the structures that the event transforms. So, finally, I want to return to Stone's 1979 paper. I detect, he wrote, an undercurrent sucking historians back to a form of narrative history. I did not detect this then. I was surprised by it. But I will now speak as the weatherman. I now detect an undercurrent sucking historians back, away from narrative history, and away from micro and subjectivist histories, and back to a concern with coherent causal explanation of societal change. One might hope then that they engage more directly and fruitfully with social scientists, who for some time now have been addressing, I think, the rigidities and the ahistorical character of their own theoretical equipment. One is tempted to say that those abandoning narrative should meet with those abandoning structure somewhere in midfield, or that theorists and empiricists should learn to respect each other. But obviously the matter is not so simple. It's not really a question of compromise and reconciliation. Rather, the task before both historians and social scientists is to reformulate their understanding of both structures and events. Structure in the sense of society as a reified totality needs to give way to an understanding of the multiplicity of structures and their intersections and interactions. Events, as historians understand and recount them, need to yield to a distinction between these mere events and fateful events, sequences leading to path-dependent outcomes, and structure-modifying acts. And this, in return, requires a sustained attention to explanation in the deeper sense of the word. So having said all this, I cannot help but note that this prescription conforms broadly to the vision of layers of time developed by Fernand Braudel, and the Annales school. He spoke of structures, enduring features changing glacially, if at all, that constrain human action and events. Also of mere events that were as numerous as they were fleeting, and powerless to change anything of importance. But in between these two extremes of historical time, he located something called conjuncture. Here, events and structures came together in fateful ways. Just what happened in this middle range of historical time, where combinations and sequences of action reset what we might call the course of events? This was only sketched out, and this mysterious category of time was often the butt of jokes by less visionary or down-to-earth historians. Then, historians had few allies among the social scientists. Today, there are a good number, a critical mass, a term that is quite meaningless but that we like to think is scientific, of historical social scientists. Is there a good number of historical social scientists seeking to historicize the understanding of this realm where agency and structure confront each other? And if I am right, a new era in which historians will seek to offer coherent explanations of change in the past in cooperation with them. So, thank you.